Have you ever spent hours and hours studying, maybe late into the night, and then the next day you take a test and you realize you can't remember anything? Or have you ever looked at a classmate who seems to barely study but always gets great grades, and you wonder, what's their secret? How do they do it? I think we've all been there. I know I have. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily, and welcome to English Club Podcast. I'm so happy you're here with me today. Whether you're listening while you're commuting or studying or just relaxing at home, thank you for choosing to spend this time learning English with me. You know, I was just thinking about this topic this morning. I was organizing my desk, and I found some old notebooks from when I was in university. And wow, looking through those notes brought back so many memories. Some good memories, but also some stressful ones. I saw pages and pages of notes that I had written, highlighted in different colors, with little sticky notes everywhere. And I thought to myself, I spent so much time on this, but was I actually studying effectively? Or was I just busy? That question really stuck with me, because there's a big difference between being busy and being effective. You can spend 10 hours studying and learn very little, or you can spend 2 hours studying and learn a lot. It all depends on how you study, on your techniques, on your methods. And that's what inspired today's episode. Today, we're going to talk all about study techniques. We're going to discuss different ways to learn, different methods that work for different people, and most importantly, we're going to learn how to talk about your study habits in English. This is such an important topic because almost everyone studies something. Maybe you're a student in school or university. Maybe you're learning English as a second language. Maybe you're studying for a professional certification. Maybe you're learning a new skill for your job. Whatever you're learning, having good study techniques makes everything easier and more effective. And being able to talk about how you study in English, that's a really useful skill. You might need to explain your study methods to a teacher. You might want to share tips with classmates. You might need to discuss your learning style in an interview or at work. So today, we're going to learn the vocabulary, the phrases, and the natural ways to talk about studying in English. Okay, so before we dive in, if you're enjoying this podcast, please like and subscribe to our channel for more English learning podcasts. It really helps us create more content for you. And if you find this episode helpful, share it with your friends who are also learning English. We really appreciate your support. All right, let's get started. Let me begin by sharing a story with you. When I was in high school, I had this friend. Let's call her Sarah. Sarah and I were in the same classes. We had the same teachers, the same textbooks, the same homework. But there was one big difference. Sarah always seemed relaxed and confident, while I was always stressed and worried about grades. I would study for hours every night. I would read my textbook over and over. I would write out notes again and again. I would stay up late reviewing everything. I thought I was being a good student because I was putting in so much time. Sarah, on the other hand, didn't seem to study nearly as much. I would see her hanging out with friends, playing sports, watching movies. And yet, when test day came, she would get better grades than me. I was so confused, and honestly, I was a little bit jealous. One day, I finally asked her. I said, "Sarah, how do you do it? You study so much less than me, but you understand everything better. What's your secret?" And you know what she told me? She said, "Emily, it's not about how much time you spend studying. It's about how you study. You need to study smarter, not harder." That phrase, study smarter, not harder, really changed my perspective. I realized that I had been using ineffective study techniques. I was spending lots of time, yes, but I wasn't actually learning efficiently. So Sarah started teaching me some of her techniques, and my studying improved so much. My grades got better, but more importantly, I felt less stressed. I actually started enjoying learning instead of just feeling overwhelmed by it. That experience taught me something really important. Study techniques matter. The methods you use can make a huge difference in how well you learn and how much you enjoy the process. So let's talk about vocabulary first. When we discuss studying and learning, there are some key words and phrases you need to know. Let me teach you the most important ones. First, we have the word technique. A technique is a specific way of doing something, a method or strategy. For example, I use a special technique to memorize vocabulary words. Your study technique is your approach to studying. We also use the word method. Method and technique are very similar. A method is a systematic way of doing something. For example, what method do you use to prepare for exams? Another important word is strategy. A strategy is a plan or approach designed to achieve a goal. For example, my strategy for learning English is to practice speaking every day. We use the phrase learning style to describe how someone learns best. Some people are visual learners. They learn best by seeing things. Some people are auditory learners. They learn best by hearing things. Some people are kinesthetic learners. They learn best by doing things and moving. For example, I'm a visual learner, so I like to use diagrams and charts when I study. We also talk about study habits. Habits are things you do regularly, often without thinking about them. Your study habits are your regular practices around studying. For example, good study habits include reviewing notes regularly and taking breaks. Another useful term is retention. Retention means keeping information in your memory. For example, this technique helps improve retention of new vocabulary. We use the word comprehension to talk about understanding. Comprehension is your ability to understand what you read or hear. For example, I practice reading comprehension by reading English articles every day. The phrase active learning is important. Active learning means you're engaged and participating, not just passively receiving information. For example, active learning techniques include asking questions and practicing what you've learned. We also say passive learning for the opposite. Passive learning is when you're just receiving information without really engaging with it. For example, just listening to a lecture without taking notes is passive learning. Another key term is memorization. Memorization means learning something so you can remember it. For example, I use flashcards for memorization of new words. We use the word review to talk about looking at material again to reinforce learning. For example, I review my notes every weekend. The phrase time management is crucial. Time management means organizing your time effectively. For example, good time management helps you balance studying with other activities. We also talk about focus and concentration. Focus means directing your attention to something. Concentration is similar. It's your ability to focus for a period of time. For example, I have better concentration in the morning, so I study difficult subjects then. Let me give you some example sentences using this vocabulary. My study technique involves reading the material, making notes, and then teaching it to someone else. Everyone has a different learning style, so you need to find what works best for you. I'm trying to develop better study habits this semester. Active learning helps with retention much more than passive learning. I use several memorization techniques for vocabulary, including flashcards and spaced repetition. Time management is one of my biggest challenges when studying. I need complete silence to maintain my concentration while studying. See how these words work together? They help us talk about studying in a clear, natural way. Now, let me teach you some common verbs we use when talking about studying. These verbs are really important for describing what you do when you study. We use review when we look at material again. I review my notes after every class. We say revise when we study material again to prepare for a test. This word is especially common in British English. I need to revise for my exam next week. We use memorize or learn by heart when we commit something to memory. I'm trying to memorize irregular verbs. We say practice when we do something repeatedly to improve. I practice English speaking every day. We use the phrase go over to mean review or examine. Let me go over this chapter one more time. We say take notes when we write down important information. I always take notes during lectures. We use highlight or underline when marking important information in a text. I highlight key points in my textbook. We say summarize when we create a brief version of longer content. After reading each chapter, I summarize the main points. We use the phrase look up when searching for information. When I don't know a word, I look it up in the dictionary. We say focus on when concentrating on something specific. Today, I'm going to focus on grammar. We use prepare for when getting ready for something. I'm preparing for my final exams. Let's practice using these verbs in sentences. I review my vocabulary flashcards every morning before breakfast. British students often say they need to revise before exams.
I'm trying to memorize the periodic table for my chemistry test. She practices piano for 2 hours every day. Can we go over the homework assignment together? I take detailed notes during every lecture so I can review them later. I use different colored highlighters to mark different types of information. After finishing a book, I summarize each chapter in my own words. Whenever I encounter a new word, I look it up immediately and write down the definition. Right now, I'm focusing on improving my pronunciation. I've been preparing for this presentation for 3 weeks. These verbs help you describe exactly what you do when you study. They make your explanations much clearer and more specific. Now let me share more about my own study journey and the techniques I've learned over the years. This will help you see how these techniques work in real life. When I first started learning English seriously, I made a lot of mistakes with my study methods. I would do things that seemed like good studying, but they weren't actually effective. For example, I would read the same page of a textbook over and over again. I thought if I read it enough times, I would remember it. But you know what happened? After reading the same page 5 times, I would close the book and realize I couldn't remember anything. My mind had just been wandering while my eyes moved across the words. I was engaged in passive learning, just letting the words wash over me without really processing them. I also used to write out vocabulary lists over and over. I would write each word 10 times, thinking this would help me remember. But this was also pretty ineffective. It was mechanical, mindless. My hand was moving, but my brain wasn't really engaged. And I used to study for huge blocks of time without breaks. I would sit at my desk for 4 or 5 hours straight, thinking longer study sessions meant more learning. But I would get so tired and my concentration would drop so much that the last 2 hours were basically useless. These were all ineffective techniques. I was putting in effort, sure, but I wasn't getting good results. So what changed? How did I improve my study techniques? Well, I started learning about how the brain actually learns. I started experimenting with different methods. I started paying attention to what actually worked versus what just made me feel busy. Let me tell you about some of the techniques that really made a difference for me.
The first technique I discovered was active recall. Active recall means actively trying to remember information rather than just rereading it. Instead of reading my notes over and over, I started testing myself. I would read a page, close the book, and then try to write down everything I could remember. This was much harder than just rereading, but it was so much more effective. The science behind this is really interesting. When you try to recall information, you're strengthening the neural pathways in your brain. You're actually practicing retrieving that information, which makes it easier to retrieve in the future, like during a test. So instead of reading a vocabulary list 5 times, I would read it once, cover it, and try to write down all the words from memory. This active recall practice helped me learn vocabulary so much faster. Another technique that transformed my studying was spaced repetition. Spaced repetition means reviewing information at increasing intervals over time. Instead of cramming everything in one day, you review it multiple times with gaps in between. Here's how it works. Let's say you learn something new today. You review it tomorrow. Then you review it again 3 days later. Then a week later. Then 2 weeks later. Each time, you're spacing out the review a bit more. This technique is incredibly powerful for long-term retention. I use spaced repetition especially for vocabulary. There are even apps designed around this principle, like Anki, but you can also do it manually with flashcards. The key is to review things multiple times over days and weeks, not just once. When I started using spaced repetition, I noticed I could remember vocabulary much longer. Before, I would learn words for a test and forget them a week later. Now I was building long-term memory. Another game-changing technique for me was the Pomodoro technique. This is a time management method where you work in focused blocks of time with short breaks in between. The traditional Pomodoro is 25 minutes of focused work followed by a 5-minute break. After 4 Pomodoros, you take a longer break of 15 to 30 minutes. This technique completely changed how I approach studying. Instead of those long, exhausting 4-hour sessions where my concentration gradually dropped, I started doing Pomodoros. I would set a timer for 25 minutes and focus completely on studying during that time. No phone, no distractions, just pure focus. Then I would take a 5-minute break to stretch, get water, look out the window. The difference was amazing. Those 25-minute blocks were so much more productive than my previous long sessions, and the breaks kept me fresh and energized. I could maintain high concentration throughout my study session. I also learned the importance of teaching what you learn. This is sometimes called the Feynman technique, named after the physicist Richard Feynman. The idea is that if you can explain something in simple terms, you truly understand it. So I started trying to teach concepts to others, or even just to myself. After learning something, I would imagine I was explaining it to a friend who knew nothing about the subject. I would talk out loud, using simple language, trying to make it clear and understandable. This technique reveals gaps in your understanding. When you try to explain something and you get stuck, that shows you what you need to study more. It forces you to process information deeply, rather than just superficially. I remember when I was studying English grammar, I would learn a grammar rule and then try to explain it to my roommate. Sometimes I thought I understood something, but when I tried to explain it, I realized I didn't really get it, so I would go back and study that part more carefully. Another technique I discovered was using multiple senses and multiple formats. This is based on the idea that engaging more of your brain creates stronger memories. So instead of just reading, I would read, write, speak, and listen. For vocabulary, for example, I wouldn't just read the word. I would write it, say it out loud, listen to the pronunciation, use it in a sentence, maybe even draw a picture to represent it. This multisensory approach helped the words stick in my memory much better. I also learned the value of connecting new information to what I already know. The brain loves connections. When you link new information to existing knowledge, it's much easier to remember. So when I learn a new English word, I try to connect it to something I already know. Maybe it sounds like a word in my native language. Maybe it relates to something I'm interested in. Maybe I can create a story or image that links it to existing knowledge. These connections make learning so much more effective. Let me tell you a specific example. When I was learning the word ambitious, I connected it to my friend's ambition to become a doctor.
Now, whenever I see or hear the word ambitious, I think of my friend, and I remember the meaning. That personal connection makes it memorable. I also discovered the importance of varying my study location. There's interesting research showing that studying the same material in different locations can improve retention. The theory is that your brain encodes information along with environmental cues. When you study in multiple locations, you create multiple retrieval cues. So instead of always studying at the same desk, I started varying my location. Sometimes I studied at my desk, sometimes in a coffee shop, sometimes in the library, sometimes in the park. This made studying less boring, and it actually seemed to help my memory too. Another crucial technique I learned was the importance of sleep. This isn't really a study technique, but it's absolutely essential for learning. Your brain consolidates memories during sleep. When you get good sleep after studying, your brain processes and stores that information. I used to stay up late cramming for exams, sacrificing sleep to study more, but I learned this is counterproductive. You're better off studying less and sleeping more. Now I always make sure to get at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep, especially before important tests. I also learned about the spacing effect and why cramming doesn't work well. Cramming means studying a lot of material in a short time, usually right before a test. Most students have done this. You have an exam tomorrow, so you stay up all night trying to learn everything at once. The problem with cramming is that it might help you pass the test, but you won't remember the information long term. It goes into your short-term memory, but doesn't make it to long-term memory. A week after the test, you've forgotten most of what you learned. Spacing out your studying over time is much more effective. If you have a test in 2 weeks, it's better to study a little bit each day for 2 weeks than to study for 10 hours the night before. The spaced practice builds strong, lasting memories. Let me share another technique that really helped me: elaborative interrogation. That's a fancy term for asking yourself why questions about the material you're learning. Instead of just accepting information, you ask why it's true, how it works, what the reasons are. For example, if I'm learning that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, I don't just memorize that fact. I ask why. What's happening to the water molecules at that temperature? Why does it happen at that specific temperature? This deeper questioning helps me understand and remember the information better. I also discovered the benefits of interleaving. Interleaving means mixing up different topics or types of problems in a study session, rather than focusing on just one thing. This is counterintuitive because it feels harder, but research shows it's more effective. For example, if you're studying math, instead of doing 30 problems of the same type, you mix different types of problems together. If you're studying language, instead of spending an hour on grammar and then an hour on vocabulary, you alternate between them. Interleaving makes studying feel more difficult because you're constantly switching, but it actually improves long-term learning and your ability to apply knowledge in different contexts. Now, let me talk about some specific techniques for different aspects of studying. For reading comprehension, I learned several helpful techniques. First, I started previewing texts before reading them. I would look at the title, headings, pictures, and maybe the first and last paragraphs to get an overview. This gives your brain a framework to organize the information as you read. Second, I started asking questions before and during reading. Before reading, I ask what I think the text will be about. During reading, I ask questions about what I'm reading and try to answer them. This active engagement makes comprehension so much better. Third, I learned to annotate as I read. I write notes in the margins, underline key points, circle words I don't know. This keeps me actively engaged with the text rather than just letting my eyes move across the words. For listening comprehension, especially important for language learning, I discovered some useful techniques. First, I learned to listen actively rather than passively. Active listening means really focusing, trying to understand, predicting what might come next. Second, I started listening to things multiple times. The first time, I just try to get the general idea. The second time, I focus on details. Maybe the third time, I listen with a transcript to check my understanding. This multiple pass approach really improved my listening skills. Third, I started listening to a variety of materials at different speeds and with different accents. This prepared me for real-world listening situations where you can't control the speed or accent. For writing, I learned the importance of outlining before writing. Instead of just starting to write and hoping it works out, I now make an outline first. I organize my thoughts, decide on my main points, plan the structure. This makes the actual writing so much easier and more coherent. I also learned the value of revising and editing. Your first draft doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, it won't be perfect. The key is to write first, then revise later. I separate the creative process of writing from the critical process of editing. For speaking practice, especially for language learning, I discovered that regular practice is more important than long, occasional sessions. 15 minutes of speaking practice every day is better than 2 hours once a week. Consistency builds fluency. I also learned to practice speaking even when alone. I would narrate my activities in English, have conversations with myself, practice presentations out loud. This felt silly at first, but it really helped. Now, let me talk about note-taking techniques, because this is such an important study skill. I used to just write down everything the teacher said, trying to capture every word. But I learned this isn't effective. You're so focused on writing that you're not really processing the information. I learned several better note-taking methods. One is the Cornell method. You divide your paper into 3 sections: a narrow left column for cues and questions, a wide right column for notes during the lecture, and a bottom section for a summary. During the lecture, you take notes in the main section. After the lecture, you add questions or keywords in the left column and write a brief summary at the bottom. This method is great because it builds in review and active recall. When you study later, you can cover the right side and try to answer the questions on the left. Another method I use is mind mapping. Instead of linear notes, you create a visual diagram with the main topic in the center and branches for subtopics and details. This works really well for visual learners and for seeing how concepts connect. I also learned the importance of reviewing and rewriting notes soon after class. Don't just take notes and never look at them again. Within 24 hours of class, I review my notes, clarify anything unclear, reorganize if needed, and add any additional thoughts. This review session really helps cement the information in my memory. Let me share something about group study versus individual study. For a long time, I only studied alone. I thought group study would be distracting and inefficient. But I eventually tried it, and I discovered both approaches have value. Individual study is great for focused learning, for working at your own pace, for avoiding distractions. It's essential for deep concentration work. But group study has unique benefits too. You can teach each other, which reinforces your own understanding. You can get different perspectives on difficult concepts. You can stay motivated together. You can quiz each other and practice explaining things. I found the best approach is a combination. Do individual study for initial learning and deep focus, then do group study for review, discussion, and testing each other. The combination is more effective than either alone. Now, let me address a really important topic: dealing with motivation and procrastination. Even with great study techniques, you need motivation to actually sit down and study. And procrastination is something almost every student struggles with. I've certainly struggled with procrastination. I would have homework to do or studying to complete, but I would find myself doing anything else.
cleaning my room, checking social media, watching videos, anything to avoid studying. I learned several strategies to combat procrastination. First, I started using the 2-minute rule. If a task takes less than 2 minutes, do it immediately. This prevents small tasks from piling up and becoming overwhelming. For bigger tasks, I started using the principle of just getting started. Often, the hardest part is beginning, so I tell myself I'll just study for 5 minutes. Usually, once I start, I continue for much longer. But even if I only do 5 minutes, that's better than nothing. I also learned to identify and address the root causes of my procrastination. Sometimes I was procrastinating because the task seemed overwhelming. Solution: break it into smaller, manageable pieces. Sometimes I was procrastinating because I didn't understand something. Solution: ask for help or find additional resources. Sometimes I was procrastinating because I was tired or hungry. Solution: take care of basic needs first. Another helpful strategy was removing temptations. I would put my phone in another room while studying.
I would use website blockers to prevent access to distracting sites. I would study in the library instead of my room, where my bed was tempting me. I also learned the power of accountability. I would tell a friend my study goals for the day. Just knowing someone else knew what I was supposed to be doing made me more likely to actually do it. And I learned to reward myself for completing study tasks. After finishing a difficult study session, I would do something I enjoy. Watch an episode of a show, have a treat, call a friend. These small rewards made studying feel less like punishment. Let me talk about a crucial aspect of effective studying: understanding your own learning style and preferences. As I mentioned earlier, people learn differently. Some people are visual learners, some are auditory, some are kinesthetic. I discovered I'm primarily a visual learner. I learn best when I can see information presented visually. So I adapted my study techniques to match this. I create lots of diagrams, charts, and visual representations of information. I use colors to organize information. I watch videos rather than just listening to audio. But I also learned not to rely solely on my preferred style. There's value in engaging multiple senses and learning modalities. So while I focus on visual techniques, I also incorporate speaking, listening, and hands-on practice. You need to figure out what works for you. Maybe you remember things better when you hear them, so you should read your notes out loud or listen to recordings. Maybe you learn by doing, so you need hands-on practice and real-world application. Pay attention to how you learn best and adapt your techniques accordingly. I also learned about my personal rhythms and preferences. I'm a morning person. My concentration and energy are best in the morning, so I schedule my most difficult studying for morning hours. I save easier tasks for afternoon when my energy dips. Some people are night owls. They focus better in the evening or late at night. Neither is better, they're just different. Know yourself and schedule accordingly. I also discovered I need absolute quiet to study effectively. Some people can study with music or in noisy environments, but not me. So I seek out quiet spaces like libraries or empty classrooms. Understanding yourself, your preferences, your strengths and weaknesses, this self-knowledge is crucial for effective studying. Now let me share some techniques specifically for language learning, since many of you listening are learning English. For vocabulary learning, I've already mentioned flashcards and spaced repetition, but there are other techniques too. One is learning words in context rather than in isolation. Instead of just memorizing word equals definition, learn words in example sentences. This helps you understand how the word is actually used. Another technique is keeping a vocabulary journal. When you encounter a new word, write it down with the definition, an example sentence, and maybe a drawing or personal connection. Physically writing helps memory, and having all your vocabulary in one place makes review easy. I also use the technique of learning word families. When I learn a new word, I also learn related words. For example, if I learn create, I also learn creation, creative, creativity, creator. Learning words in families is efficient and helps you see patterns. For grammar, I learned that understanding is more important than memorization. Don't just memorize rules, understand why they work. And most importantly, practice using grammar in real communication. not just in isolated exercises. For pronunciation, I discovered the value of recording myself and listening back. It's uncomfortable at first to hear your own voice, but it reveals exactly where your pronunciation needs improvement. Compare your recording to native speakers and identify specific sounds to work on. For speaking fluency, I learned the importance of thinking in English rather than translating from your native language. This is hard at first, but it's essential for fluency. I practice this by narrating my daily activities in English, thinking about what I would say in different situations, having mental conversations. For listening comprehension, I used graduated difficulty. I started with slow, clear materials designed for learners. As I improved, I moved to more authentic materials, faster speeds, different accents. This gradual progression built my skills without overwhelming me. For reading, I learned the value of extensive reading. This means reading a lot of easier material rather than struggling through difficult texts. When you read easier material, you can read more, enjoy it more, and naturally encounter and learn new vocabulary and context. Now, let me share some thoughts about using technology for studying. We have so many tools available now that didn't exist when I was first learning. These tools can be incredibly helpful if used wisely. Apps like Anki for spaced repetition flashcards are fantastic for vocabulary learning. Apps like Duolingo or Babbel provide structured language practice. YouTube has unlimited educational content on every topic imaginable. I use my phone to listen to podcasts and audiobooks in English while commuting or exercising. This is making use of time that would otherwise be wasted. I use apps to block distracting websites during study time. I use Google Calendar to schedule my study sessions and set reminders. But technology can also be a huge distraction. Social media, games, endless entertainment, all right there on your phone. So I've learned to be intentional about technology use. I turn off notifications during study time. I use apps to limit my social media time. I keep my phone out of reach when studying. The key is using technology as a tool to support your learning, not as a distraction from it. Let me talk about preparing for tests and exams specifically. This requires some special techniques beyond regular studying. First, I learned to start preparing well in advance. Don't wait until the week before an exam to start studying. If you've been using good study techniques all along, preparing for a test is just review. But give yourself at least 2 weeks of focused review time for major exams. Second, I learned to find out exactly what will be on the test. Talk to the teacher, look at past exams if available, review the syllabus. Study efficiently by focusing on what will actually be tested. Third, I learned to create a study schedule for test prep. Break down what you need to review and allocate specific times for each topic. Having a plan reduces stress and ensures you cover everything. Fourth, I practice with similar test formats. If the test will have multiple choice questions, I practice with multiple choice. If it will be essay questions, I practice writing essays. Familiarity with the format reduces test anxiety. Fifth, I learned the value of study guides or summary sheets. I create one-page summaries of key information for each topic. The process of creating these summaries is valuable study in itself, and then I have concise materials for last-minute review. Finally, I take care of myself physically before exams. Good sleep, healthy food, exercise, staying hydrated.
Your brain works best when your body is well cared for. On test day, I've learned some helpful strategies too. I arrive early to avoid rushing. I read through all instructions carefully before starting. I answer easy questions first to build confidence and secure those points. I manage my time, checking how much time I have left periodically, and I review my answers if time permits. Now let me discuss something that often gets overlooked, the importance of breaks and rest in studying. Taking breaks isn't laziness. It's a crucial part of effective studying. The brain needs downtime to process and consolidate information. If you study continuously for hours without breaks, your concentration drops, your retention decreases, and you get mentally exhausted. As I mentioned, I use the Pomodoro technique with regular breaks, but even beyond that, I make sure to take longer breaks too. After a few hours of studying, I might take a 30-minute break to walk, exercise, have a meal. I also learned the value of days off. You can't study effectively 7 days a week indefinitely. Taking a full day off each week actually improves your overall productivity and learning. During breaks, I do something different. I don't just switch from studying one subject to studying another. I move my body, get fresh air, do something enjoyable. This genuine rest refreshes my mind. I also learned about the benefits of diffuse thinking. This is when you're not actively focused on a problem, but your brain is still working on it in the background. Sometimes the solution to a difficult problem comes when you're in the shower or taking a walk, not when you're sitting at your desk staring at it. So taking breaks isn't wasting time. It's an essential part of the learning process. Let me share some thoughts about dealing with difficult subjects or topics you find boring. Everyone has subjects they struggle with or don't enjoy. How do you study these effectively? First, I learned to acknowledge my feelings rather than fight them. It's okay to find something boring or difficult. Accepting this reduces the emotional resistance. Second, I try to find personal relevance or interest in the topic. Maybe the subject itself is boring, but can I connect it to something I care about? Can I make it relevant to my goals? Third, I use the principle of eating the frog. This means tackling the hardest or most unpleasant task first when your energy is highest.
If I have several things to study, I do the difficult or boring one first. Fourth, I make boring material more engaging. I turn facts into stories. I create games or challenges. I study with others to make it more social. I find creative ways to make the material more interesting. Fifth, I use rewards. After completing a session on a difficult or boring subject, I do something I really enjoy. And sometimes I just push through. Not everything in learning is fun or easy. Sometimes you just have to do the work, even when you don't feel like it. Building discipline and perseverance is part of becoming an effective learner. Now, let me address a common challenge: balancing studying with other responsibilities. Most people aren't full-time students with unlimited time to study. You might have work, family responsibilities, social commitments. I learned several strategies for this. First, I became more efficient with my study time. Using effective techniques means I need less time overall. 2 hours of focused, effective studying beats 4 hours of inefficient studying. Second, I learned to use small pockets of time. Waiting for a bus, review flashcards. Lunch break, listen to an educational podcast. These small moments add up. Third, I learned to say no to less important things. You can't do everything. Protecting time for important priorities like studying sometimes means declining social invitations or other activities. Fourth, I integrated learning into daily life where possible. If I'm learning a language, I change my phone settings to that language. I listen to music or watch shows in that language. Learning doesn't have to be separate from living. Fifth, I communicated with people in my life about my goals and asked for support. When my family and friends understood that I was working toward important goals, they were more understanding when I needed to study instead of hang out. Balance is difficult and always changing. Some weeks you can study more, some weeks less. The key is consistency over the long term, not perfection in the short term. Let me talk about something that can really derail studying: perfectionism and fear of failure. I struggled with this a lot. I would avoid studying because I was afraid I wouldn't do well, or I would spend way too long on one assignment trying to make it perfect. I learned that perfectionism is counterproductive. Striving for excellence is good. But perfectionism, the idea that anything less than perfect is failure, that's harmful. I learned to embrace mistakes as learning opportunities. When I got something wrong, instead of feeling like a failure, I tried to see it as valuable feedback. Mistakes show me what I need to work on. I learned the concept of good enough. Not everything needs to be perfect. Sometimes done is better than perfect. This was hard for me, but it reduced my stress and increased my productivity. I also learned to separate my worth from my performance. A bad grade doesn't make me a bad person. It just means I need to study differently or try harder next time. Your academic performance doesn't define your value as a human being. These mindset shifts made studying less stressful and more effective for me. Now, let me share some wisdom about long-term learning versus short-term cramming. We've touched on this, but it's worth emphasizing. Our education system often encourages cramming. You have a test next week, so you cram information into your head, take the test, and then forget it all. You might get good grades this way, but you're not really learning. True learning is about building knowledge and skills that last. It's about understanding, not just memorization. It's about being able to apply what you've learned in new situations. This requires a different approach. It requires spacing out your learning over time. It requires connecting new information to what you already know. It requires practicing and applying what you learn. It requires reviewing and reinforcing over time. I've tried to shift from a test-focused mindset to a learning-focused mindset. My goal isn't just to pass tests.
My goal is to actually understand and remember the material long term. This shift in mindset affects how I study. I don't cram anymore. I study consistently over time. I focus on understanding rather than just memorization. I seek to apply what I learn in real situations. And you know what? This approach actually leads to better grades too, as a side effect. But more importantly, it leads to real learning that stays with you. Let me share some final thoughts as we wrap up this long discussion about study techniques. First, there's no one perfect study technique that works for everyone. We're all different. What works amazingly for your friend might not work for you. You need to experiment, observe what works, and create your own personalized approach.
Second, effective studying is a skill that can be learned and improved. You're not just born good or bad at studying. You can get better through practice and by learning better techniques. Third, studying effectively isn't just about academic success. The skills you develop, discipline, focus, time management, critical thinking, problem solving, these skills are valuable for life, not just for school. Fourth, be patient with yourself. Changing your study habits takes time. Don't expect to transform overnight. Make small improvements consistently, and over time, you'll see significant results. Fifth, remember why you're studying. Keep your goals and motivations in mind. When studying feels hard, remember what you're working toward. This bigger purpose can sustain you through difficult moments. Sixth, take care of yourself. Effective studying requires a healthy body and mind. Don't sacrifice sleep, nutrition, exercise, or mental health for studying. These things support your studying. They don't compete with it. And finally, enjoy the process of learning when you can. Yes, studying can be challenging and sometimes tedious, but learning new things, understanding concepts, developing skills, there's a real satisfaction in this. Try to find moments of curiosity, discovery, and joy in your studying. I want to emphasize one more time that the best study technique is active engagement. Whatever specific methods you use, the key is to be actively engaged with the material. Don't just passively read or listen. Question, think, connect, apply, teach, create. Active learning is effective learning. And remember, learning how to learn is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. In our rapidly changing world, the specific facts you learn in school might become outdated. But if you know how to learn effectively, you can learn anything you need throughout your life. You know, as I've been talking about all these study techniques, I realize that I'm still learning too. I'm still experimenting with new methods, still adjusting my approach, still sometimes procrastinating or struggling with motivation. Learning how to learn is a lifelong journey, not a destination. But I can say that learning about study techniques and applying them has made a huge difference in my life. I learn more effectively now. I enjoy learning more. I feel more confident in my ability to learn new things. And I hope that sharing what I've learned can help you on your own learning journey. I'd love to hear from you. What are your favorite study techniques? How do you like to learn? What methods work best for you? And what challenges do you face with studying? Leave a comment below and practice describing your study habits in English. I read all the comments, and I love hearing about your experiences. And please, like and subscribe to English Club for more English learning podcasts. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I know it was a lot of information, but I hope you found it helpful and interesting. Remember, you're capable of learning anything you set your mind to. With the right techniques, consistent effort, and patience with yourself, you can achieve your learning goals. Whether you're learning English, studying for school, or pursuing any other knowledge or skill, you have what it takes. Keep practicing your English. Keep experimenting with study techniques. Keep learning and growing. And remember, everyone learns differently, and that's okay. Find what works for you, and don't compare yourself to others. Thank you again for being here with me today. See you in the next episode. Take care and happy studying.